Hello and welcome to the Telltale Cake, where we tell tales with cake and we try to ignore the corpses under the floorboards. With me today is my dear friend, failed Proverbs 31 woman, afflicted with the spirit of Jezebel, Caroline. Hello, Caroline. How are you?
Hello, Beth. And, I should also add that in many ways you are more of a failed Proverbs 31 woman than I am.
I make bread.
You know what? I'll give you that one. You do make bread.
Other than that, yes. But I have an umbrella of protection.
It's an umbrella with holes in it, though, so is it really giving you proper protection?
Well, it needs to be under a man's umbrella, which is a metaphor that makes sense if you have never used an umbrella, because umbrellas do not work like that.
Yeah, it's an odd metaphor. I don't understand, I guess, I don't know if Bill Gothard came up with that, but, had he used umbrellas? Did he know how they worked?
I'm guessing no, because not only is putting one umbrella underneath another umbrella not efficient, it's not possible because of the way umbrellas are made. There's a stick in the middle of the umbrella. You can't put something directly underneath.
Well, no, you'd have to have it be one large umbrella that, has multiple ones up top. But then still the metaphor doesn't work because presumably you'd be just taking your own little brave umbrella out from under the umbrellas. So it just falls apart.
It's just not a good metaphor.
No.
So I'm going to ditch the metaphor.
That's a shame because that is a very pretty parasol.
It is, however, we are indoors. So I'm going to take a sip of liquid from my opaque pool wine glass so that you get the wrong idea of what I'm drinking.
You could be setting me up to stumble by doing that.
Speaking of stumbling, we need to evaluate each other for eye traps to see what kind of stumbling blocks we are posing for our male brethren.
Okay.
Now, we're going to have a specific guide for how to do this.
Oh, okay, good. Because, we're just women. We wouldn't know.
So back in, I believe it was 2006, there was a rather infamous modesty survey sent out to thousands of strictly boys and young men, largely homeschooled between the ages of 12 and 20, I think. And they were sent a list of statements going over women's clothing in incredible detail and asked whether or not they agreed that with various statements about how various things might be a stumbling block.
Well, I can definitely just tell you already that both of us are wearing V-necks, which, as I recall, was a problem.
Right. V-necks, shirts, or dresses are a stumbling block, even if they are not revealing. 34.4% agreed that is true. And I think we can agree that both these V's are somewhat revealing.
They are somewhat revealing. Also, you can't tell, but both of ours are wrap types, which I do believe is also considered to be a problem.
Let me search this really fast because I don't recall this, but there's a lot. And
when she says they go into minute detail, they go into very minute detail. As I remember, it goes into the thickness of fabrics, whether jeans have pockets on the backs or not, whether a shirt that is under a shirt, such as a tank, is considered modest, even if it covers everything, or if that in and of itself is a problem. Whether wearing a bathing suit underneath a shirt is a problem, if you can see that there are bathing suit straps.
I don't see anything about wraps. However, I can say shrugs, the short shirts and jackets that just cover the chest, draw too much attention to the bust. 59% of respondents agreed that is true. So a
majority?
Yes. So I am currently wearing a little jacket because otherwise I would be showing off my God-dishonoring shoulders.
Can't have that.
And probably some bra straps.
Oh, definitely can't have that. Now, you can't tell from where I'm seated, but I'm wearing a very long skirt, which for most people would be considered very modest, but it does have slits. It has 2 slits on each side, and those slits come up past the knee, which is definitely a problem.
Oh, going back 1 second, shirts or dresses that are gathered around the chest draw too much attention to the bust.
That must be what I was thinking of, yes.
57% of respondents agreed with that. Yeah. So V-necks, gathered. I'm wearing a shrug that draws attention to my chest.
Also, how long does your skirt come? I didn't notice.
It is just above the knee. I am wearing a short skirt above leggings, which is
Probably a problem.
specifically addressed.
Oh, is it? I guess it would have been, because I'm trying to think, like around that time period, skirts above leggings was a popular item.
See, mini skirts, long shirts, or short dresses over leggings are a stumbling block. 64% agree with that.
Goodness.
Now, to get back to your horse slits in your skirt.
Well, the fundamentalist girl solution to that problem is to use safety pins to close them. I remember actually seeing people do this.
Skirts with slits are immodest. 29% agree with that.
Oh, okay. That's the minority.
Yeah, but there's still, there's 30% of 12-year-old boys that are definitely finding you immodest.
I love the concept of asking teenage boys what they think arouses lust, as if they had never met a teenage boy, as if they'd never been exposed to teenage boys ever.
In the immortal words of Xander from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I'm 17. Looking at linoleum makes me want to have sex.
Exactly.
Now, so we've covered all the obvious clothing things. However, we do have another statement.
Uh-oh.
A girl's physical posture and or position can be a stumbling block. And 84.7% of respondents agreed with that. Is the way we're sitting a stumbling block to men?
I think that there's not a way I could sit that would not be a stumbling block. I think that might just be a problem unless I put a literal, sack over my upper part of my body.
Have you tried just not having breasts?
I would, but it just costs so much money,
It does that.
It costs money to be a true Proverbs 31.
And one thing about modesty standards that I do want to mention, since we've gone through that little exercise, is that not only are they kind of arbitrary, they're very culturally specific.
Oh, super.
So when I lived in Tanzania, one will see boobs all of the time. They're just there. Mm-hmm. You might, at any point, need to whip out a breast somewhere in public to feed a child or to put sugar on your nipple and give it to a child who may or may not be yours in order to get it to shut up.
That's a great solution, frankly.
Right?
Very practical.
Yeah, I go so many places where there's screaming children in public. You know what would bother me less?
A nipple with sugar on it.
That a kid is attached to, and the kid is quiet.
There we go.
I'm fine with that. Conversely, in Tanzania, knees are very arousing. So I have a lot of skirts that were made for me in Tanzania. They are so tight through the hips that you can see every movement of my butt, which...
Wow. That would be a problem, yes.
However, then they flare out so that you cannot tell that my legs bend in the middle.
Interesting.
So it is perfectly modest.
Yeah, it's so interesting how culturally dependent that is. So, I remember hearing as a teenager that the standards in Florida were different because people just dress more casually there. And so it wasn't actually considered immodest to show your shoulders, for example, because they knew a losing battle when they saw one.
That's so practical.
It is practical because Florida, you're half the time wearing a swimsuit anyway.
Now, the important thing to keep in mind on all these differing modesty standards is that it's all about policing women's bodies.
Sure, of course.
In the incredible book Persepolis, Marjane Satrapi makes the, I think, very accurate observation that the point of all this, having to go out and worrying about whether your hair is showing, whether you've got your biofastened right, you get so worried about the little things that you don't have time to worry about the big things, like how fucked it is that we've got a modesty survey that is incredibly detailed about all of women's posture and movement and clothing.
Right. And for those who don't know, Persephone, that book is a graphic novel that's a memoir about a young woman who grew up in the Iranian Revolution. 100% recommend. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. Read Persepolis. Official recommendation. Read Persepolis. So why are we even talking about this? Today we are covering the book The Woman They Wanted by Shannon Harris Bonne. Shannon is a woman who converted to a rather nasty form of evangelical purity culture fundamentalist bullshit cult. And she spent a while in there, and then she was married to a celebrity pastor that I don't want to mention the name of, because either you already know and you already kind of think he gets too much attention, or his name doesn't mean a lot. And I just find him annoying. And in fact, his little brothers are the ones who put out this modesty survey.
Correct. Yes.
So it all circles back. So this is her memoir of being the good woman in this kind of weird evangelical cult and then leaving. And I'm really excited to talk about this with you specifically because you are also a former pastor's wife.
Yes.
You did not get a lovely book deal on your exit.
I didn't.
I hate that for you.
Shocking. I mean, so very obvious differences. So I was the wife of someone who was actually going to be an Episcopal priest. At the time, he was a deacon. And so the expectations are different. You're not expected to give as much free labor, for one thing. But there are expectations. I won't go into all of that right now. Also, it was different because I grew up in a very conservative Calvinist church, whereas our author here actually chose to join it as an adult, which I find fascinating.
I find it incomprehensible, even after reading her book.
Yes, and we will talk about that.
But first, on this show, we eat cake with our books. And today we are eating pie, which is sort of like cake. And we are specifically eating a grasshopper pie. Shannon talks about having to prepare and freeze a lot of mint pies. And also about how she couldn't drink on a glass of wine on Valentine's Day because somebody might find out about it. So my grasshopper pie is custard with creme de menthe and creme de cacao and cream on top of a crushed Oreo crust. And I did not do a great job making it, so I don't know how set it is, and it is also a little bit overflowy and gloppy.
But I bet none of that affects the taste, though.
Note that this is not baked, so if we were to eat this whole thing, we might get a mild buzz from...
Oh, no.
Is the way we're sitting while we eat causing men to sin?
Probably, because I'm going to have to lean a little bit, and that could cause my bosoms to be a little bit more visible.
Oh, God.
Well, it tastes lovely.
I should make this more often. I do it occasionally, and it's always good.
Yeah. No notes. It's excellent.
For me, I would like to have gotten the custard to set a little bit better, so it's a little less soupy, but tastes good.
So I actually have this is not related exactly to the book, but I have a story that this reminds me of. My grandmother was in a interfaith women's little study group along with some other ladies. They were all part of this small town. But there was a mixture of Presbyterians and Baptists. As you may know, Baptists only drink when no one's there to see that.
Right.
So her next-door neighbor was a very strict Baptist, even when no one was looking.
Oh, my.
And also just a little bit, very sweet lady, but kind of naive. So she was at this Presbyterian pastor's house, and this pastor's wife was not... she caused people to stumble, shall we say. She was kind of a firecracker. And so one of the ladies was serving creme de menthe cookies. And this one, my grandmother's neighbor, leaned into the pastor's wife, very hesitantly, whispering, trying to ask, without actually saying, if the creme de menthe cookies had liquor in them. And she wanted to know this very discreetly. And loud enough for everyone to hear, the pastor's wife said, "No, but we've got some in the cooler if you need it." So she's my vision of what an excellent pastor's wife actually looks like.
I love that.
Also, if you are gluten-free, this is not an ad, but Oreo is now doing these gluten-free mint Oreos, and actually they're really addictive, and I think there's cocaine in them.
I don't judge. Back in the day, you used to be able to just buy cocaine. I mean, I realize you still can, but you could go to a store and buy cocaine.
Right. It didn't have to be a crime.
And, Freud would give his patients cocaine for talk therapy.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I could get through therapy so much faster.
I've been to multiple therapists. None of them have ever offered me cocaine. Unbelievable.
And, it makes sense because, if you've ever been around someone who is on cocaine, one thing they like to do is talk.
Correct. So, like, if you've seen the John Mulaney stand-up where he talks about his addiction very openly, he gave a interview to GQ magazine when he was very high on cocaine, and it is exactly as wonderful as you're imagining it might have been.
I want to look up this interview right now.
No, it's incredible, and you should. It's great. But yeah, no, it's not something that you want to be published doing, maybe. But as a assistance to helping you talk to your therapist, yeah, I can see that.
It will definitely help you talk. One of Freud's colleagues, he was an eye doctor in Austria, and he would give his patients cocaine. And all those choices you have to make at the eye doctor, is it like 1 or 2 or 2 or 3? I could make those decisions so much faster.
Because it's very intimidating. I never know if I'm doing the right thing, and I second guess myself. It's terrible.
And what's really bad is when they're kind of the same to me.
Right.
I want to get the right answer.
Yes, and it's like, especially I think if you were maybe a little bit too much of a perfectionist as a child, it's like, I want this to be correct. And that's not really a thing that I think normal people worry themselves about at the eye doctor.
I wonder where we got that need to...
Who knows?
So let's talk about Women They Wanted.
Yes. So first of all, just to give a little bit of background, the writer Shannon Harris had a very privileged and sounds actually until the divorce like a great childhood. I'm envious. It was very secular, not explicitly atheist or anything, but just very secular, upper middle class, definitely, background in which her parents had access to things like country clubs and tennis courts and things of that nature. And she had what sounds like a pretty happy childhood. I don't know. That was my reading of it.
Mine as well. She talks about her parents getting divorced as something that gave her basically decision paralysis for the rest of her life, which there's a lot of places where I don't necessarily understand her or relate to her in any sort of intellectual way because she's just such a different person from me. She'll talk about getting into fights with her husband because she can't figure out what color to paint the wall.
Yeah. That was a little odd. I mean, to be fair, when her parents got divorced, they maybe didn't do the best thing, and they basically gave their children a choice about who do you want to mostly live with, which sounds kind of horrible.
I would not want to be in that position.
I would not want to be in that position, and I can see how that would give someone decision paralysis, Not sure how that translates into paint colors, but, there is an A to B. I can kind of understand that.
And it doesn't sound like her parents necessarily got her therapy post-divorce, and pre and during, which I feel like is probably helpful because if you're going to have to make the choice about where are you going to live, I think you need a therapist to help navigate that because...
I think you would. I will say, though, even though her parents were secular and upper middle class, she's a little bit older than we are. I don't know, maybe about 10 years or something. And so I do get the impression that therapy wasn't as widespread, and it probably just didn't even occur to them.
And it's one of those things where that's the world that they lived in.
Right.
It was not necessarily as much get therapy.
Right.
So that's not necessarily on them.
No.
So she's gone through this divorce. She gets asked by some friends to go to church.
Right. And I do want to add here, she had, at this point... she had graduated college. She is an educated, fairly sophisticated young woman in her 20s who, it seems to me, has a life. So she does go with them to church. she dresses very, what to me, I would think you wouldn't wear this to church. But again, I grew up in it, so of course I would know that. Yeah. But she describes wearing something that was like 6 inches above her knee, a dress. Heavens. And, people stare at her, whatever. And then she also describes being love bombed, of course, which is a thing that cults do. Mm-hmm. I actually had that experience when I was at Barry. I tried going to a PCA Presbyterian church very briefly when I was still trying to make the whole Calvinism thing work. And it was a kind of country church, and I think they were very excited to see someone younger than 50. And they absolutely love bombed the hell out of me. I mean, I was invited to someone's house for lunch the very first day. I was invited to join the choir on the second week. They were so super welcoming that it was creepy, and I left. She does not leave, however. She keeps going. And I could not understand it, and I don't know if it was the writing. I'm not sure what it was, but I could not quite understand what the draw was for her and why she kept going.
Same. She describes just feeling tired on her way back from church, which relatable.
Yes.
Especially if for no other reason than many church buildings are poorly ventilated and you're in there with a lot of people and it just becomes close and stuffy and it makes me tired and gives me a headache.
Yeah. So I think especially in the the church she was going to, it is one of these non-denominational churches that nevertheless does have very much a theological background. But
they won't admit to it, but they've got one.
They won't admit to it, but they have one. And the background of this church, though, it's kind of a hybrid. So they're borrowing from both the Calvinist, Reformist, kind of Presbyterian tradition on the one hand. They're also looking into the charismatic movement, which really picked up steam during the Jesus movement in the 60s and 70s. So they're leaning into that tradition as well. And those are actually two pretty different traditions. And then they're combining them, which I think is, on a historical note, fascinating, I think, just sociologically to take these two very disparate traditions and try to make them work. I do think that because they do that, it ends up being actually way more strict than either one of those traditions would be on their own.
And let's also remember that the head of this place later, of course, was convicted of various sex crimes. And one of the hallmarks of people who do sex crimes is that they like to set up really strict gender-based hierarchies. Mm-hmm.
Now, actually, correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding was that the pastor himself didn't do that, but that he covered up other people doing it.
I'm not clear on the details. I thought there was definitely
sex crimes. That happened. I'm not sure who exactly did it, and the book was kind of vague on that, which I understand. So, there were definitely sex crimes. They were definitely covered up. It caused a split in the church, and it was a whole mess. Unfortunately, that's a tale as old as time. Mm-hmm. But, so in the plot of the story, though, she does decide that she wants to keep going to this church.
The only thing that gives me any clue about why is when she talks about wanting to hurry past the intro stuff so she can get to the fun stuff, which does not answer my follow-up question of what here is fun. But again, I grew up in this, so...
Right. I will say also you grew up in Church of Christ, which on the fun to not fun meter is way on the not fun side.
True.
There were more fun options.
Watching paint dry would be a slightly more fun option than your average Church of Christ service.
Exactly. So... reading between the lines, because I can't emphasize enough that it was not clear. Reading between the lines, I think that she was wanting two things. One was community, which everyone wants community. It's not a secret that American society is set up in such a way that many of us feel isolated, and that if you don't have something like a church or some sort of social function that you're a part of, you can feel very alienated. And I can see that. There was also a sense, I think, that she wanted to make sure that her children did not have to go through a divorce. And I think that probably was a high motivator for her. She wanted to make sure that she put them in a situation where they would have a, ironically, happy childhood and have the very steady and no divorce. Like that was, I think, a big motivation for her.
This kind of purity culture really does promise marriage perfection. So this was getting kind of popular in my church about the time I was in the teenage class. I remember watching a VCR or VHS tape about, like, from her former husband, I believe.
Okay.
And it was about a bunch of happy couples having met in this weird courtship thing that he invented, talking about how they're still going to be together in 10 years because, of course, the church has a moral panic about divorce.
Right. So it's interesting. So without giving too much away, this book that she's talking about came out in the late 90s. So I was aware of it. It was kind of in the cultural milieu around where I was. But my church didn't follow courtship. South Georgia also gets onto things a little bit slower than the rest of the country does. And so the people I knew dated. It was just you had to be, physically pure. I don't remember ever hearing like, if you even have a crush on someone, that's bad or anything quite like that. It wasn't as strict as the sort of purity culture that is set up in the book. Which to the uninitiated, the idea is that you don't even date anyone before. You go through a courtship, you go through this courtship phase that is very much parent-directed, and that's a very big point. And you don't even kiss, ideally. You have very little physical contact, and ideally, you have a pretty short engagement. And then, of course, once you marry this person that you, frankly, barely know, you are married for life.
And you are expected to be sexually available at all times.
Correct. I do recall this was somebody at my church I grew up in. She once posted about how when you don't have to worry about consent when you follow God's plan because you say yes once at the altar, and that's for all time. So we can ponder that and the implications of that.
Marital rape only became outlawed in all 50 states in 1998.
Correct. So in Tennessee, when they were trying to get that passed, there was I believe a state senator who said, well, where I come from, when a woman says I do, she does. So that gives you an idea of
the attitude.
The attitude, yes. One thing I found very interesting about her courtship with her husband is that I don't think it did really go according to what they preached, which is intriguing because he literally wrote the book on it. And I'm guessing that that's because they didn't consider her parents to be good leaders in this role, but I didn't get the impression her parents were really involved at all. It's almost as if the leaders of the church, who were very much grooming her future husband to take over, were the leaders of the courtship, which was interesting because it means that even in the traditional, not really traditional, courtship ideal, the woman does at least have her parents kind of on her side, but she really had no advocates in this situation.
They also do the cult thing where they try to separate her from her friends, from all the stuff with her secular life. She doesn't end up with any of her friends at her wedding.
Yes, I found that to be fascinating, that they wouldn't even permit any of her friends to be her bridesmaids. Like, that just kind of blew my mind.
It's very culty.
Very culty. We also do want to talk about the fact that when she joins this church, they have her do a covenant. Now, I think this became popular with churches like Mark Driscoll's church in Seattle, which is it's kind of in this, it's in the same cinematic universe as this, I would say. Also Calvinist but weird. And
I think Calvinist but weird is the best description
Yeah.
of this sort
Calvinist,
of theology.
But weird, yeah. So they have you sign off all these things that you're going to abide by. Like you're going to, what she mentions in the book is that you agree to be part of a small group, because otherwise you're kind of lost in a sea of people in this megachurch environment. I don't think she ever says how big it is, but oftentimes these are upwards of 3,000 people.
Her husband is a celebrity pastor, so you've got to have a megachurch for that to work. The other reason we are pretty sure it's a big place is that she gets to do the ideal woman thing where she doesn't have a job and her husband supports them both in a pretty nice situation.
In a very nice situation. I do want to say, having that kind of financial support is not the norm for pastors' wives. Most pastors' wives I knew worked.
Including you, right?
Including me. It's not a high-paying gig. And, unless you are in some kind of megachurch situation. If you're not, especially if you're like and this was not my situation, but if you're in like some country church, then even the pastor himself might have a job on the side. Because you're only going by what the church can pay you, or if you're in my situation, what the diocese can pay you. And so like I said, it's not a high-paid situation. So most pastors' wives do not enjoy the kind of economic privilege she has, which we'll talk more about that.
I will say that was the case for the pastors or preachers' wives. Church of Christ is too boring to have pastors. They can only have preachers.
Sure.
But the preachers' wives did not have jobs. And part of the reason I think that worked in that situation was because the church owned a house that the preacher could just live in.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, they had a rectory. So that helps, yeah.
They would never call it that.
I was about to say, no, I'm sorry. That is way too, mainstream Christian.
That sounds almost Catholic.
That was basically what we did. We lived in a house owned by the church for a short time. But yeah, you're right. They wouldn't say rectory.
I think that helped a lot, just not having to pay a mortgage or rent, which it would.
Yeah, that does help a lot. So I'm sorry, back to the covenant. So part of this that you sign off on, which she definitely did not ask very many questions about this, is that you agree to, they may not use the word submit, but that's basically what it is. You agree to submit to church discipline. And this can mean different things in different contexts. So in my experience, church discipline meant you're not allowed to take the Eucharist for a certain period of time. That's the only thing I knew of growing up. And I don't even think I ever knew anyone that happened to. That was kind of given as an example. But in these types of cult churches, it can mean literal shunning. I know in Mark Driscoll's church it did.
They might call it disfellowshipping.
There we go, disfellowshipping. And so where people, church members will not even talk to you if they see you in the grocery store, you're basically persona non grata, which if that's your entire community is extremely abusive. I mean, extremely abusive. But so she signs off on all of this. And I get the impression, and I may be judging her hard, I get the impression she didn't super research what she was getting into.
I would tend to agree with that. There are times in the book when I sympathize with her and times when I don't. Mm-hmm. And one of them is, you have an education. You should read contracts.
You should. And so this is the thing. I will admit, Beth and I are both biased here because we did not get a choice about growing up in sort of fundamentalist cultures. We were born into it, and which is a totally different situation. So I have less sympathy than maybe I should for someone who is a fully grown adult.
With an education.
College educated.
With loving parents?
With loving parents and a upper middle class, very privileged background, who was never taught that women should submit, had a very strong maternal example, which she emphasizes multiple times. And you left all that and you chose to join this. No one forced you to. Like, no one forced her to do this. And it may be because of the writing, but I never got a clear, I mean, other than just assuming she wanted that community and a no divorce life for her children, there was never really a clear example of her having like a real religious conversion. My theory is that she might have, and she feels embarrassed about it, and she kind of retconned it. Because she talks about how she kind of confesses her sexual sins to God, but even there she's saying, well, maybe I didn't mean it. And so my gut reaction is to think that maybe she did have some sincerity about it, but she feels guilty about that now.
That's possible. That's honestly the only thing that makes any sense to me about why she did this.
Right.
I would even have understood it if she'd said she wanted to be involved with the celebrity pastor world.
Right.
Because I would get that. She's in her 20s, like, even educated. We've all done stupid things in our 20s.
We all do stupid things in our 20s.
Maybe she did it for love, but I also never got the impression that she really loved her husband. Maybe.
Yeah, that was hard. Like, I didn't really super get that impression. And I didn't super get the impression that he loved her very much. I mean, it's hard to say. That's, a relationship. She didn't go into that many details with their relationship, but she does
which is fine.
Which is fine. At one point, she does say he never looked her in the face and said that she was beautiful, which seems odd.
It does.
Having been in a heterosexual marriage before, it just seems odd to me. So they end up getting married, and he does end up getting the senior pastorate position at this megachurch. To give an idea of the scope of that job, it sounds as though there are at least 25 full-time pastors being hired, which is wild. That is so wild. Most churches have one, maybe a youth minister or music minister, maybe an executive pastor or whatever. That is so wild. It is so over the top and so beyond the experience of most evangelicals.
I think when the church I grew up in was getting big, we had 2.
Right, yeah. For reference, my church growing up never topped 100 members, ever.
We had 300 to 400, I think.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, 300 to 400. That's a pretty.
That's a pretty good size.
That's a pretty good sized church, and that's fairly normal, I think, for an evangelical church. This would have been magnitudes way past that. And one of the interesting things is that because she has all this privilege, it's also kind of a double-edged sword, because she has this economic privilege, but she's obviously ambitious. She does want to do musical things with the church, which doesn't quite end up the way she wanted it to. And she obviously feels very stifled and like she doesn't have a creative outlet. And I'm sympathetic, although, again, she chose it. I'm sympathetic until we get to her homeschooling.
Yes. So I'm sympathetic with the way she gets into fights with her husband about what to cook, because the bargain she thinks she's made is that she gets to be the Dickensian angel in the house and have because it's like a separate complementary sphere where the woman rules over the home. So she feels like she ought to have a space where she has a certain amount of control in her house.
Valid.
She also finds out that another person who lives there and who is not doing the cooking but is her headship has opinions about what he wants to eat. And which I would say having opinions about what you want to eat is valid, but not if you're not doing the cooking or the shopping.
Right. Or if, it's one thing if I have opinions and we're going to talk about it and we have an equal situation here. It's another thing if it's I have opinions and you're expected to submit to my opinions.
Which is very much the way it is. But she finds that about the one place where nobody cares where she does is how she homeschools her children. And this bothers me immensely because children are entitled to an education. regulations around this are super lax. I think the law was changed recently here in Georgia such that in order to homeschool your children, you now have to have a high school diploma.
Oh, imagine that.
Fascinating. So I was homeschooled from 5th through 10th grade. And I have very strong opinions on this. I was not just taught by my parents deciding that I should go to the grocery store and learn what a teaspoon is one day or to do math. I was enrolled in an actual school that mailed me stuff, and I mailed it back to an actual teacher. It was distance learning before Zoom was cool. So it was an actual accredited school. There are ways to do homeschooling that are good. If you either outsource it with distance learning, which she has the money and resources to do.
Absolutely could have done that, yeah.
Or you put in a lot of work and you learn how to teach. Teaching is really hard work.
Yes.
I've also worked as a teacher. It's extremely hard. I'm very bad at it.
Most of the people in my family are teachers, like actual teachers, not just like playing around in the house. No offense, but that is kind of what it is.
That's what she's doing.
That's what she's doing. They're actual accredited teachers, and it's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of hard work, and I mean, to the point where my dad taught special ed, and when he was expected to have to sit in with his students who were in special ed in regular chemistry classes, which that's kind of wild, because he cared about it, he got all these chemistry textbooks and was studying up on it so he could actually help his students. It's hard work.
It is. It is not something you just decide, oh, this is a place where nobody cares what I do, so I can do whatever I want. Because again, children are entitled to an education, not only by local law, but through international treaty with the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child.
Although, to be fair, the U.S. never signed it.
Yeah, we're so bad on human rights.
It's bad. Well, I think the reasoning there is that it comes out against corporal punishment. And a lot of powerful interests in the U.S. are pro-corporal punishment.
Ugh.
Yeah.
I hate that. Yeah. Getting back to my rant. All the studies we've done on this subject in the developing world say that the strongest correlating factor with the success and standard of living of a child is having to do with the education level of the mother. So the fact that evangelicals encourage women with no qualifications to teach just whatever to their kids is setting up an entire generation for failure. And this is a generation that has no say in it. A 6-year-old child is not equipped to make decisions on quality of education.
Yeah. And because it's very much a closed loop system. So it's not just that they're being homeschooled, but then they have other outside things. In this world, anything outside is the church. It struck me as deeply ironic when at some point she does put them in school. And with apparently zero self-analysis, she says, I wanted them to have outside influences, so they went to the school that was run by the church.
Not an outside influence.
Not an outside influence. I went to a school that was run by a church. It was a little bit more of an outside influence for me because it wasn't my church. So it was a little bit different, but still, no. Like they were literally in a completely closed loop. So they might have been getting a better education. I don't know. But if socialization was the goal, that wasn't happening.
I find that the people who talk about socialization of children with relation to school are not usually the same people who were unpopular in school.
That's very valid. I was not popular in school. It was dreadful. But I will say I think that if done well, if there's not, just rampant bullying that no adults involve themselves with at all, it can help you at least to get the basics of human interaction down. And I say that because I say this with kindness, but there is a look when you see a homeschooled child, you know that they're homeschooled.
they are very good at interacting with adults.
Yes, they're excellent at interacting with adults, which they take to mean as confirmation that they are being socialized well. But what that actually means is that you're socialized to interact with people who are your superiors, and that you never interact with people who are your peers, which can be extremely damaging, I would imagine.
I mean, I actually did have a lot of truly outside influences because I did a lot of things because my parents were all privileged and stuff.
Right.
And the parts that I spent, again, I did attend a public elementary school through 1st through 4th grade.
That would help.
I found it very relieving to not be in public school, though, because public school children are awful if you are not good at concealing that you're a mildly smart kid.
So I had that problem in a private school. It was a problem that I liked to read.
Yeah.
And I was told that I used big words. This was also a problem. And I think that more just had to do with the fact that it's South Georgia and everything's very anti-intellectual across the board. But yeah, I mean, it was very much like you need to tone yourself down. And so I just learned that the best way to avoid criticism was to not talk at all.
The same. Is that a good socialization skill, though?
It's really not. It's not great. So I think it's a balancing act. I mean, I would never say that all homeschooling is bad because I don't think that. I think it can be helpful, especially, let's say, if you have a child with special needs and the public school cannot serve them and is underfunded and, things like that. Or if you have a situation where your child is very much the target of bullying or racial discrimination or something like that. There are cases where Black parents pull their children out of majority white schools because they're being taught a bunch of racist nonsense. I understand that. I'm sympathetic to it. But I just think it has to be so carefully done with thought to the educational quality that the children are getting, because children deserve an education. And I did not get that sense. I got the sense from her that this was like her pet project that gave her a sense of fulfillment. But the focus was on her and what it did for her and not what it did for her children.
There's a part of the book where she talks about going from victim to perpetrator because she's she's the church's trophy. This is the girl who gave up her dreams for the church.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And then it becomes her job to go tell other women that they can't go pursue careers.
Right.
And she identifies that as going from victim to perpetrator, but she never identifies what she does to her children in denying them a good education as a perpetrator.
Yeah.
And I can understand not wanting to write too much about your children in a book while your children are alive, but I hope that this is something that they as a family can address and work through.
I do too, because, I mean, there was this other kind of just throwaway thing where she talks about the fact that, of course, in this society, you're expected to do corporal punishment of your children. And she just kind of mentions as a throwaway thing that she would either use a wooden spoon or this flexible, like, rubber thing. And that she thought that the flexible thing would be, like, nicer or whatever. And I'm like, wow, that means that that's just such an example of how you didn't come from this and yet you just didn't know.
This is an example of where the BDSM community would actually be helpful for corporal punishment, because I know a lot of people who will say that they will always bottom with a toy before they top with it so they know what it feels like.
Yes, and she clearly...
She does not know the difference between...
She doesn't know.
She doesn't know.
She doesn't know. And, I mean, because it's this, she doesn't go into great detail because, again, her children. But she does talk about how they were doing this with toddlers, which I think a lot of people don't realize that with these kind of fundamentalist groups. They're doing this very, very young. Like this, especially with some of the really strict ones, they start when they're babies. So it gets really bizarre very fast. But yeah, I didn't see her taking on that perpetrator role in regards to her children either, which I hope that she's able to work through that a little bit.
I do feel like this book is written somewhat too early if that makes sense. Like, I think that if she'd waited for a little bit more after deconstructing, she might have had a better approach to it. I also don't really hold that against her because I feel like she probably has come to a point in her life where she actually needs money and the book deal is calling now.
Right.
Which is not shade. Like, get your money.
Yeah. You got to get paid. It's fine.
And I also don't blame her for not talking about that because that would be very much biting the hand that's feeding her right now. There is one case where she addresses her financial privilege, which I think is interesting, which is right before her husband gets handed the leadership. The church leadership tells them to go ahead and move into a nicer house now because doing it right after you get a major promotion might look bad.
Yeah, that was funny. That was very funny. And she mentioned several times that it was a 4,000 square foot colonial, that she has her breakdown in, which I've never had a breakdown in a 4,000 square foot colonial, but it sounds like a nicer experience than having a breakdown in a small apartment. I can only imagine.
I mean, I've had a breakdown in a nice house, but that was just because I was renting one room in that house.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, that's a little bit of a different experience too, yes.
And it didn't have air conditioning.
Oh, that's a very different experience.
I don't necessarily recommend having your breakdown in a house in Houston that doesn't have air conditioning.
Ooh. No, not recommended. Always have your breakdowns in housing with air conditioning.
Have it in a nice 4,000 square foot colonial with air conditioning?
Yeah, with air conditioning. That's the important part. So, just to kind of, in the plot, she ends up, everything comes out, or at least some of the things come out about
the sex crimes.
The sex crimes. And it... I'm sure in this situation, there were already probably some rifts happening, and this just exposed everything. And so she goes through what I'm sure was a very painful process where these women that she thought were her friends just turn on her immediately because they were on the other side of this. It also sounds a lot like the head pastor who was kind of who was really like guiding her husband, and his wife was really guiding her or telling her what to do.
Ordering about,
yes, that's a good way of putting it. It does sound like he's a narcissist. I mean, I don't want to diagnose, but he hits a lot of those markers. And he basically decides to go off and start his own mega church somewhere else, Lexington, I think. And she and her husband and children, while they're still trying to salvage their marriage, decide to move back to the West Coast, which is where he's from. And so they do, and it sounds to me, and you can tell me what you think of this, it sounds to me like he maybe starts deconstructing before she does.
I think it's very much that, which I think is the only part of what I'm about to say next that I have any sympathy for her on is that I don't think she realized necessarily he was deconstructing. Mm-hmm. She was still doing... I think the phrase would be toxic compliance, where you end up dealing with things that aren't okay by doing everything you're supposed to.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I might have the wrong term for that. But so she's doing all the things, even the things she doesn't want to do, which includes she makes this bargain for this bad life. Mm-hmm. And one of the things she's supposed to get out of it is financial stability and never having to work. When her husband starts deconstructing... And they do not have this kind of relationship as a husband and wife where they would talk about their religious feelings, which is kind of weird given his job and her position. But
it's a little weird.
I think his deconstruction catches her off guard, and he asks her to get a part-time job because he's not really making the money off the church that he used to. Mm-hmm. And she's very upset about this. Mm-hmm. Now, I am sort of on the good God, get a job train, but I can kind of see where she's coming from.
Mm-hmm. I can kind of see it because the thing is, she gave up the ability to have a solid job history.
Yes.
Which would make it more challenging to do. And based on the timeline, I'm thinking that this was probably in a time where it was kind of hard to get a job, which also would make it more challenging if you have been, baking cakes for 10 years. And so I understand that. But there was also a part of it for me that was just really annoying. Because it's like, it's as if she didn't understand the amount of privilege that it takes to be like, I just don't want to work, and therefore I'm not going to.
Especially the kind of purity culture that this denomination has constructed is very much historical revisionism. Mm-hmm. Their idea of courtship is like if somebody thought about the Regency but has never actually read Jane Austen and thinks courtship and comes up with an idea of what courtship should look like.
Yes.
And this whole idea that the women never work and never have their own money is not really going to work unless nobody works, because they're all extremely rich. There's not really been a time ever when most people just live like that.
Yeah.
So just for anecdotal comparison purposes, I'm going to include a link in the description below for a marital satisfaction quiz from 1939. So in 1939 values, it is a merit for a wife to be willing to take a job to help out, and it is a demerit for a wife to remind her husband constantly that they are living on her money. So let's all take a moment to think about how 1939 is more progressive than purity culture.
I will say 1939 is also the tail end of the Great Depression, so you can see why it would be economically useful to have two incomes coming in.
Oh, yes.
I will say it does feel as though with all of these very fundamentalist groups, they're looking at this particular historical anomaly, which actually a lot of society does this. It looks at this particular historical anomaly from about 1945 to about 1970 and uses that as a guide to how society should function.
Though this is, well, in the U.S., this was a time of unprecedented economic ability.
Yeah. Right.
You could, without any sort of advanced degree, you could just support a wife, support children, send them to college.
If you were white.
Yes, if you were white.
And I think they look at that period, and it's understandable to have some nostalgia for that. I have a little bit of nostalgia for something I never lived through because it sounds great to not have student loans. But without noticing that, first of all, that was not available for everyone, especially if you were Black. And also that if you go back even a little bit farther, it really was not the case. If you go back even a little bit farther, a lot of women were having to work. Even if they were taking in work, like taking in ironing or sewing or something like that, a lot of women were economically contributing to their households. And certainly if you were poor or working class, I mean, you were probably working outside the home, like in an agricultural setting even, or in a factory setting once the Industrial Revolution comes about. So it's such a historical anomaly to say women can stay at home and not bring in any money.
But that's the historical anomaly that they're running with.
Yeah, and even though that's no longer the world we live in, for better or worse. And so she kind of clings to that and clings to it for longer than is really practical. There was an interesting thing where he decides to go to seminary, and she even takes some classes, or maybe, I don't know, maybe she's just auditing. I wasn't quite clear on that. And this was one of those things where I felt probably too critical of her. And I'll admit, that's probably on me. I just felt like she makes decisions for emotional reasons and not logical ones. And then she kind of tries to retcon that by saying, well, women make decisions for intuitive, emotional reasons, and that's a good thing, and that's why we have power. And anyway, it's a whole thing. And so it just seemed to me like she makes these decisions on the fly for emotional reasons. Like she suddenly changes her entire mind about whether women should be pastors after she meets a woman who wants to be a pastor. Like, she doesn't actually study about it or think about it or do reasoning. No, she meets someone who wants to be a pastor, and she's like, yes, women should be pastors. Then she meets a lesbian couple, and it's great that she's now pro-gay rights, but that seems to have been her turning point. She didn't think about it in any real sense. She just meets a lesbian couple, boom, I've changed my mind. And so it seems like she basically did the same thing with her conversion. It's like, I've met these people. It seems like they don't get divorced. Boom. I've just suddenly become, uber
trad wife.
Uber trad wife. And it's just, that was annoying.
It was a struggle for me to get through the whole second half of this book.
Oh, God.
Because she starts... Instead of relating anecdotes, she starts writing little essays about her opinions on what women are like, which,
oof.
Granted, I have a little bit more tolerance for that coming from another woman than from a man.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And I've read plenty of essays about what women are like from men. Mm-hmm. However, I really wish that she would not try to put women in a different box than the ones that her former church were putting women in, because she wants to go on about how women are intuitive and emotional and in tune with nature, which, first of all, I call shenanigans.
And wolves, somehow.
Yeah. She is not in tune with nature. Which is fine. Like, I think nature is a damp and inconvenient sort of place where plants and animals wander about uncooked. She, in an episode that I find incredibly relatable, decides she is going to be a good Proverbs 31 woman and make a garden, but then it becomes a whole lot of work, so she gives up halfway through and just feels guilty every time she looks out the window.
Oh, yeah, no, that was super relatable. I once tried as a wife to have a garden, although this was outside of an apartment, so it was already a bad idea. And we had these pretty squash blossoms that came up, and then weeds ate the whole thing. But I was so ignorant about horticulture that I thought the garden was doing great. So, relatable. Truly.
Totally. Like, I totally relate to somebody who fails to do a garden. Like,
yes.
I went to a seminar on sustainable gardening, and I went home and tried to start a garden, and it was really hot, and I just gave up.
Like, gardens have bugs. Like, you have to touch bugs. You have to get dirty. Gross. No, not about it.
Yeah. No, I have planted tomatoes.
That's more than I've done, so congratulations.
That was my COVID project. I grew a tomato. So, bullshit, she's not connected to nature any more than we are.
No.
Second, it's great that she feels empowered by thinking, like, okay, well, I was told women are these evil, sinful creatures, but no, I'm beautiful and powerful and, like, loving and nurturing. But I am as much of a woman and as feminine as a beautiful, empowering, nurturing, empathetic woman if I'm an ugly psychopath. Like,
yeah.
I can be a woman as an ugly psychopath, as a beautiful nurturer. I have options as a woman.
Glad to see that you've apparently reviewed your options.
There's a range.
There is a range. Elizabeth Holmes is a person who exists. There are options. You
can wear turtlenecks and talk in a fake voice and run a scam and be a woman.
Be all that you can be. Be a girl boss.
The first Ponzi scheme was actually invented by a woman, and then a man, Charles Ponzi, got it named after him.
Well, see, there you go. If that isn't the history of feminism, I don't know what is. So yeah, and I do, to give her a little bit of credit here. If you come from a Calvinist background, which she doesn't really, but kind of, sort of.
Weird Calvinism.
There is a tendency, and I think it definitely plays into this weird Calvinism as well, to view everything as important if it is logical, reasoning-based. There's a very Western concept of intelligence that is prized. It's a very literate-based kind of concept, which makes sense historically, given when the Reformation happened and its connections with the printing press. And because of that, they really devalue things like intuition and emotion. So I understand that she wants to reclaim that. I'm very sympathetic to that.
Especially because we've already criticized her for making decisions based on emotion.
Yeah, especially because we're sitting here just being real misogynists and, criticizing her for making emotionally based decisions. But I do feel as though because there's a part of her that still hasn't really deconstructed from that still thinks of like, well, women are these emotional creatures. And she now thinks that's a good thing. But she hasn't gotten to the point of thinking women are just people.
I do kind of want her to go take a women's studies or women's lit course because one of her little essays, gets so close to just saying virgin whore dichotomy. And I think she would really benefit from having some academic language and some academic guidance in how to approach thinking about women.
Yeah, and I mean, frankly, most of us could use that. So,
Right.
that's not really a criticism just of her, I think. But I do think it would help her to kind of sort out, all of the brainworms that she got from being in this system.
She is going to therapy, which I appreciate.
Awesome.
She does just put some stuff that her therapist has given her, like a personal bill of rights, into the book, which felt kind of like she was trying to reach a word count, which I get. Like, I'm not criticizing. I don't think she's a great writer. I don't think she knows how to write.
I am criticizing. I don't think she's a good writer.
I'm trying so hard to be sympathetic about that because I'm pretty sure that all she's ever read besides The Joy of Cooking is, which she talks about all the time.
She talks about that a lot, yeah.
Is Bible study books, which are all terribly written. And while I don't think it's sufficient to be a good reader in order to become a good writer, I think it's necessary to be a good reader in order to be a good writer. And I don't think she is. Yeah. That is my theory, not being a writer.
Yeah. My theory is that she hasn't really read much, and that the kind of things that she's read are probably, I'm about to sound very judgmental. I'm just going to embrace it. She's read things like blog posts and websites and the kinds of, tell-all confessional books that she's kind of basing this off of, which, frankly, I don't think are usually very well written. So, yeah, I mean, like, I embrace it. I'm bitchy. I'm just going to embrace it. I don't think it was well written.
I am bitchy on your behalf because I think you should have gotten this book deal because you are also a former pastor's wife. You have an actual degree in English.
True.
And frankly, I think you could use the money more.
That all of those things may be true, but I didn't have a celebrity pastor husband.
Have you tried yelling at your ex-husband about that?
I've tried, but he hasn't responded. I mean, we're actually on great terms, but he has not. He has not. Therefore, fixed the problem retroactively of not having been a celebrity pastor.
I guess that's fair.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it sounds like, she obviously didn't want to put too much information in there. I worry about her oldest child because it's a daughter, and she puts just enough information in there for me to know that, like most oldest daughters in this culture, she was probably doing a lot of unpaid labor and childcare, and probably was extremely anxious about doing the right thing. So I worry a little bit about her. But it sounds like they're also getting therapy and, doing as best as one can expect under the circumstances.
So I really do wish her a good life and like a better life and some good therapy. She's starting to make music now. I'll link to some of it. I personally don't like it, but that's more to do with my taste in music than anything else.
Well, she wasn't doing opera or heavy metal. So
exactly.
What were you going to find likable about it? Nothing, really.
Very little. She talks, in fact, about wanting a very simple melody, which is kind of the opposite of what I want out of my music. I believe more is more musically. And in most of life.
Right. Yeah. That's your go-to.
The time has come for us to rate this book on my unitless sugar scale.
Yes.
I actually have a lot to say about sexiness. Because there's, in this kind of weird Calvinism, there's so much magical thinking around sex. We were talking about this a little bit. Sex is considered either the evil, everything poisoning pill that will just destroy your chances of happiness if you have it outside of marriage. But inside of marriage, it is the magical thing that will fix all marital problems, which is a lot to put on a sex act, frankly.
Yeah, like, I mean, yes, sex matters. If it's heterosexual sex, you can get children out of it. You know, you can have bonding and all kinds of fun stuff, and it can just also be fun. But it's not life and death. Like,
No.
this seems to make it so that it's not only just life and death, but as you said, it's like this magical cure-all for all of the problems. Like, you don't have an emphasis on things like communication, which arguably matter more.
At some point, there's only so much sex you can have. At some point, you're going to have to talk to each other.
You're going to have to talk to each other, at least maybe post-coital. I mean, something's got to happen where you actually air the problems of your paint choices.
She is not equipped to deal with that.
No.
She actually tells her elder pastor's wife about some of her marital problems, and this other woman tells her, well, how often are you initiating sex? And our author responds, well, I don't really like it. And the response is, well, you have to.
Yeah, that exchange kind of baffled me just because I can't imagine the people that I grew up around being that upfront about it. But I think that's more of a cultural difference. We were good Southerners and, you know, things are a little more opaque. So I think that was a little shocking that woman was that upfront about, like, well, do you initiate, you know? But I think that is kind of the general philosophy is, like, if you're a woman, you just have to kind of suck it up, you know, lie back and think of Jesus or something. So
Jesus is not sexy.
No. Although they did get someone extremely buff to play him in Passion of the Christ.
He is depicted as being super shredded in a lot of paintings.
Yeah.
What's with that?
Somebody was feeling a little horny, perhaps.
Well, a lot of those pictures were painted by Italians in the Renaissance, but nobody was gay until the 70s, is what I've learned from conservatives. So clearly,
including ancient Greeks, right? So
famously heterosexual ancient Greeks.
Yes. Never gay ancient Greeks. So what is the next question on your scale?
Uniqueness.
So it is a little bit. There are definitely more books coming out about deconstructionism. So it's not totally unique in that regard, but it is something, if you knew about who her husband was, this is an interesting story because it's talking about basically the devolution of a marriage that was founded on the idea that the marriage would last forever.
By her husband, who incidentally wrote the book on how to do perfect marriages when he was like 20.
Yeah, like, you don't know anything when you're 20.
No.
Like, just shut up and don't pretend that you know things.
These sorts of environments have a shaky relationship with expertise at best.
Yeah, I think so. So, yeah, I would say, middling unique, because you do have that little perspective there. As far as deconstruction, not super unique because, those are coming out with more regularity now, I think.
But it's one of maybe the earlier ones, so I'll give it a little, maybe half a platypus.
Half a platypus.
That's the most unique animal I can think of.
Okay, half a platypus. All right.
Maybe just a platypus egg, because they lay eggs for some reason.
Yeah, platypus egg. There we go.
Like women, you cannot put platypi in a box. They will defy all boundaries.
Yes, they will. And they'll stick their little flippers outside of it.
And it will be very cute, but some of their flippers will have little poison spurs on them. So
they do? I didn't know that.
I think just the males, maybe. I don't.
Okay. Anyway, yeah.
I love those animals.
They're great.
The G stands for gender. And a lot of this is about a very strict, rigid, gender-based hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. So you do have a lot of talk about gender. That's one of the main themes of the book. As we said, I think she would definitely benefit from a little bit more study on, like, women's issues and gender, etc. But she obviously is trying to, move past the kind of strict gender roles. So, it's interesting. It's interesting in that I think if you didn't grow up in this background, it gives you a little bit of insight into the kinds of expectations that those places put on gender roles.
Right, because I never knew about, like, the whole covenant stuff or whatever. I have no idea if people, like, joining the church I grew up in would have to sign anything or agree to anything or do any sort of mandatory stuff.
Yeah, like, the people at my church, like, you had to, I think, normally what would happen is you would get a letter from another church saying, yes, this person's a Christian, basically. Or you'd, like, give your testimony or something.
Fascinating. You have reference letters.
That's a thing. And I grew up knowing that was a thing and not even thinking it was weird. Reference letters are a thing, yes.
That's awesome.
It's great.
Do they have a special seal, the elders? Like that
if they did, it'd be fantastic. I don't think they do, tragically.
They should look into that.
They should. Like, your letters are always sealed, and it's lovely. So, but I don't think there was any covenant signing, any of that weirdness. Like, that's just some culty nonsense.
It really is. So the A stands for axiness, because, of course, Franz Kafka says that a book should be an axe for the frozen sea inside us. This doesn't tell me anything I don't know.
Yeah, negative axiness. It's possible that if you grew up outside of this, that this could be maybe not an axe, maybe a butter knife.
Yeah.
Maybe a butter knife, you hack away at something long enough. But for me, it was basically negative axiness. I didn't feel like it gave me any real knowledge that I didn't already know, or it just confused me based on what I do know.
And it's not even a big enough book that it would make a good axe. Like, if I were to meet her husband and I wanted to hit him, like, this would not be my weapon of choice.
No, you go for the Russian authors.
Yeah. They are good axes in many ways.
In many ways, yeah. But no, not an axe, I wouldn't say. Possibly a butter knife.
I'll go with butter knife. Mm-hmm. Finally, we have readability, and as we keep alluding to, this is not well written.
No. The first half is not too bad because there are stories happening. There are anecdotes, which are necessarily more interesting, frankly, than sort of, how to say this politely.
Don't. Just say it.
Creative nonfiction meditations on subjects. That's kind of what the latter half of the book is.
That's actually better than what I was going to say, which is like half-assed blog posts.
Ooh, yeah.
I feel like I'm reading her live journal, frankly.
It was, yeah, you're right. There was a hint of live journal in there.
We are definitely from a certain internet generation.
Yeah, we are. There was definitely some live journal. I feel like I've read blog posts that were better, frankly. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't, it wasn't hard to read.
No.
If that's the standard of readability. But the second half was not engaging. I had to kind of force myself to keep going.
I would call that actually hard to read.
True. Yeah.
It's not difficult to understand. It's just difficult to get through it because it's boring. I felt like she was kind of padding words. Mm-hmm. I found it annoying the way, like, why was she talking about wolves all the time?
I don't know. She read this one book that talks about women as wolves, and it really just stuck in her brain, and she just wanted to really milk that for all it was worth. I don't know. But she talked about it a lot, and I have never once felt like a wolf. It was very weird.
I haven't either. Maybe we just aren't connected enough to nature, but neither is she.
I think the problem is that we use our lady brains and we're not using our intuition and vibes.
I think if we got more in touch with our vibes, it would work better.
Ugh, that sounds gross. I don't want to do that.
Let's not get in touch with our vibes.
No.
All right, we have no vibes on this podcast.
No. This is a non-emotional, very Calvinist sort of podcast.
Well, Caroline, thank you for bringing your irresistible grace to my show.
Thank you.
I I would give you a tulip if I had one.
Aw, a tulip. We won't even explain that joke. If you get the reference, I'm so sorry.
It's sort of like Shannon Harris' husband. If you know who it is, you know. If you know what the tulip is, you know.
Yep. So yeah, I would give you a tulip as well. They are beautiful flowers. But thank you for having me. Thank you for baking this delightful pie that we had, pie/cake. And thank you for the idea.
Absolutely. Thank you for picking this book. Is there anything you would like to tell our audience to read?
You know what? Actually, a better book about evangelical culture is Jesus and John Wayne.
I agree.
I can't remember the writer because...
Christine Cobb-Dumetz?
I'm going to go with that because I had nothing. So, don't assume that that's correct, but it might be.
Don't.
It might be, but if you Google Jesus and John Wayne, you'll get there. And it's a nonfiction and not a memoir, but it's excellent.
It's also
very good.
Very well written. It's written by a historian. Read it. There's also an excellent podcast, Behind the Bastards, that has done some episodes based on it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Also, if you haven't, read Persepolis.
Yes.
Marjane Satrapi is an incredible author. She will make you think. She will make you laugh. She might make you cry. She made me cry.
Oh, yeah. Made me cry, too. Excellent book. There was also a movie done on it, a cartoon.
Which is still good.
Which is still quite good. I thought it was a very well-done adaptation, which she was involved with. But, yeah, she's delightful. If you get a chance, please do read that one as well.
All right. Thank you all. And I need a better way to sign off than saying like and subscribe because I'm getting kind of over that. Stay Proverbs 31, women. Have a spirit of Jezebel. Do whatever you need to. If wolves do it for you, be a wolf. If you want to be an emotionless Calvinist like us, feel free. You know what?
Have a tulip.
Do whatever you want, friends. Don't let other people tell you what women should be.